Thank you, Sarah. Good morning. My name is Chris Cox, and I'm one of the cybersecurity instructors here at CDSE. I want to welcome you to our first installment of our monthly series, the Cyber Awareness Update, where we'll discuss some of the vulnerabilities and focus areas of concern that have come up over the last 30 days. In this and in future sessions, we'll go over a selection of the top issues and discuss their impact and their remediation strategies. Every month, there will be a recorded webinar to help explain some of these hot issues, with a live session like this one every quarter. Please remember that this list is not all-inclusive, and you're highly encouraged to look at vulnerabilities that may impact you or your organization specifically. Later on in this webinar, we'll discuss some resources where you can get that information, including those that are probably right in your organization already. But before we get started, I'll turn it over to our producer, Tina, who will go over the navigation options. Tina?
Chris. Good morning, everyone. So let's start with the navigation portion. If you look in the upper right corner, you'll see an icon with 4 arrows. You can enlarge your screen at any time for a full view of the presentation. However, reselect that same icon if questions, poll questions, or chat appears. Next, in the bottom left, you'll see notes and announcements for this webinar. We have closed caption directly below. This allows audio portion to present it as text. Then we have a question and answer box. You're welcome to enter questions at any time throughout the presentation. At the end, if time permits, the presenter, Chris, will answer as many questions as possible. There's a file share box in the bottom right. The presentation PDF form is loaded for you to download at any time. Lastly, we have a couple of poll questions for you to answer. You simply select a radio button for your response. That ends the navigation of the meeting room. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Tina. Today we'll be covering 5 major domains. Specifically, we'll talk about malware, hardware and software issues, human-related vulnerabilities, and network considerations. Before we continue, let's establish a common set of definitions for the domains shown here. Malware, short for malicious software, is software that's intended to damage or disable information systems, to steal information or have other undesirable consequences. Often when we talk about malware, we're talking about viruses or spyware, but there's a lot of different kinds as well. Hardware issues can be a little bit more difficult to define, but here we're talking about issues related to that affect hardware platforms over which the user has little or no control, either through configuration or settings. For example, where a firmware or version upgrade is required. Software issues are those over which the user may have a little bit more control, such as by disabling certain features or changing certain settings, although a patch or upgrade may still be required to remediate a vulnerability. Vulnerabilities related to individuals or groups are those that are primarily driven by direct human interaction, such as social engineering attacks or the stated intent of organized groups. And network vulnerabilities are those that primarily affect network components or infrastructure. Please note that any technologies or products that are mentioned in this webinar are only to discuss the relevant vulnerabilities and do not constitute endorsement by the CDSE or by the federal government. Before we begin, let's take a look at who's participating in today's session. Go ahead and select your role in the organization so we can get a feel for who would benefit the most from this information and tailor to those roles. We don't want to get too far into the weeds, so we're not going to really get into technical implementation, but we also want to cover the aspects that would be of importance to you. Okay, great. I see quite a mix of individuals are participating today, so it's great to see all these different perspectives coming together. A lot of other security functions. Maybe we need to drill down a little bit more later on and kind of get a feel for who's participating so you can make sure you get the information that you need. Thank you for voting on that. So first we're going to cover malware. Malware in general is a significant concern for any organization, so it's very important to keep an eye on current trends and security technologies. But of course we know that security is not solved by technology alone. It's up to us to make sure that our users understand their role in protecting the organization from malware threats, especially when a careless click has the potential to impact the entire network. A good example of this can be found in the recent spread of new ransomware variants. For those of you that might not be aware, ransomware is a form of malware that blocks access to a computer until a ransom is paid. Most often this is done by encrypting key files or locking the screen, where the user is told how to pay the ransom. This means that a user or an organization can lose access to important files if they're not backed up securely. If the ransom, which can range anywhere from $20 to several $100s, is paid, the user might get access to their files again, or they might not. There's really no guarantee except for the word of the writers of the ransomware. There's a couple of different ways that ransomware can be caught on a computer, so it's important that users understand what to look for and how to avoid it. One way is by clicking on email attachments, while another is by visiting compromised websites, which will then infect the workstation. A couple of examples of ransomware includes CryptoWall, which now actually has a version 3.0 that's been significantly upgraded from the original version. There's also fake antivirus programs that do the same thing, or fake FBI alerts informing the user that they've committed some sort of crime and have to pay a fee to unlock their computer. Of course, the FBI doesn't work that way. Like all incidents related to malware, the best defense is always prevention. You know what to look for and how to avoid infection in the first place. This means helping your users understand their roles and responsibilities when it comes to cybersecurity, and also making sure that anti-malware solutions are working properly. But if you are infected, the next best thing is recovery. Hopefully we all back up and securely store our critical data. This will allow you to recover your files without paying a ransom that may or may not actually decrypt your files again. Of course, the malware itself should be cleaned up before the backups are restored, or else you risk reinfection. Now, QR codes used to be everywhere. Although they're not as popular anymore, they're still pretty common, and they're making a comeback as smartphones become more and more prevalent. You can find them everywhere, from products to stores or mysterious stickers on subway walls. They're even putting them on tombstones now in some places. They were originally designed for use in the Japanese auto industry and eventually became popular for other applications as well, because they're fast and they can store a lot of information. But that also introduces the risk. There's a lot that can be done with QR codes, some of it beneficial and some of it is potentially harmful. Criminals follow money, and the adversaries are always looking for ways to do their job a little bit better. And with more smartphones in use than ever before, they're going to use whatever they can to get whatever they want. QR codes can be used for a lot of different things, including launching a website, downloading files, or even altering operating system files or settings. The problem is there's no real way to tell a safe code from an unsafe one just by looking at it. The code might send you to a compromised website, or it might change the settings on your phone in a way that you probably wouldn't want. A great example of this happened recently with the Heinz ketchup. Some of you may have heard of this one in the news. Heinz had a contest that you could enter by scanning a code on the back of the bottle. The problem was that once the contest ended, someone else bought the URL that the code was attached to. When a man in Germany scanned the code on his phone to enter the contest, not knowing it had ended, it directed him to the correct URL, which now hosted an X-rated adult website. Although that can be embarrassing, the code itself could as easily just as redirected to a site that contained malware and could have compromised the system. And that really highlights the problem with QR codes. They're more or less permanent once they're printed or published. Another example since patched was with Google Glass. Google Glass automatically scans QR codes that you see for Wi-Fi connection information, which was briefly used to exploit vulnerabilities in the platform and display ads. So if you're going to use a QR code, make sure that you trust the source, not stickers on a wall. And remember that existing trusted codes can be covered up with a small sticker to go to something a little more malicious. Some QR code readers will let you preview the action before launching the site or the program, which is definitely a lot better than connecting to something without knowing what it is. Next, we'll talk about hardware-related vulnerabilities, where the flaw is generally found in the firmware or other non-user accessible settings of the operating system. There's often a lot of overlap with software vulnerabilities, so it's important to look at your systems and your resources from a holistic perspective in order to keep yourself secure. Currently, iPhone represents about 37% of the smartphone market in the US. And according to Apple, 83% of compatible devices are running iOS version 8. It's a lot of phones. All those devices running the latest version are susceptible to a denial of service attack caused by specially crafted text messages. There is not yet a fix available for this vulnerability, although Apple has released a beta version of iOS version 8.4, which will allegedly address this issue. The release date for the public has not yet been announced. Barracuda makes web appliances for network management and malware control. Version 8.1.005 and below use default security certificates, which enabled an attacker to commit a man-in-the-middle attack. In other words, the attacker could intercept data traveling across your network. An update is available from the vendor, so the firmware should be updated as soon as possible. Rockwell Automation makes industrial control systems that can be found in our critical infrastructure, marine environments, wastewater plants, and other industries. The RSView32, one of their monitoring control systems, does not properly encrypt the user's credentials prior to version 7.60.0, which can result in a loss of sensitive information. A patch is available from the vendor in order to remediate that vulnerability. So now moving on to software. Software is the security concern that most of us interact with, including the users, on a daily basis. Just think about all the times you interact with a piece of software every day, from your office applications to the operating system itself. And with that in mind, remember that Excel 97 had an entire flight simulator hidden in the programming. Now that was a fun little Easter egg in that case, but most users had no idea that an entirely different application was hidden in the code. Web browsers are a common target for exploitation, because that's what the user uses to interface with websites or web applications. So a compromised website can do a lot of harm to a vulnerable or misconfigured browser. Within the last 30 days, Chrome, Firefox, and Internet Explorer have all reported significant vulnerabilities that could allow a denial of service attack or, in some cases, executing tasks or arbitrary code. In addition, Firefox versions before 38 may allow an attacker to obtain sensitive information from memory. Updating the software closes those vulnerabilities. Adobe Flash is also often updated, largely because there's frequent exploits targeting it. Much like the web browser, Flash can be exploited by malicious websites, so it's important to keep it updated. Currently, multiple versions of Flash Player and Air have vulnerabilities that might allow an attacker to bypass write protections and to write to the file system. Wireshark is a network monitoring tool that allows the user to view traffic running across the network. It's used primarily for network monitoring or troubleshooting. But certain versions, shown here, allow an attacker to send a crafted packet that will result in a denial of service against the systems on which it's running. Update it to the most current version in order to remediate this vulnerability. Windows still maintains the largest market share among computer users, which is why there's more exploits leveraged against it. However, a significant number of information systems use one of the Linux variants. And much like Windows, periodic updates keep the system a little more secure. Currently, versions of the Linux kernel, before version 4.0, have vulnerabilities that may allow an attacker to gain privileges, perform a denial of service attack, or gain write access to the file system. An update is required to close those vulnerabilities. And finally, Cisco Unified Meeting Place version 8.6 between 1.2 and 1.9 allow attackers to inject arbitrary code, read files, or obtain sensitive information using a crafted URL or resource request. Now behind every attack, somewhere down the chain, there's an individual. Maybe it's the person that created the piece of malware, or maybe it's the hacker that's targeting your organization. Let's take a look at one in particular just a little bit closer. According to the FBI, law enforcement, military personnel, and government employees may be targeted by hacktivists, or hackers with a political motivation. This can come in the form of releasing their personal information online, called doxing, or dangerous pranks like swatting, which is tricking a SWAT team into a forced entry into a victim's home, or even cyber attacks. So maintaining a good cybersecurity posture is part of the best defense here. The attackers are making heavy use of social networks, so make sure to check your privacy settings and be aware of what you post. Make sure your home security settings are properly configured, and always be suspicious of unexpected links or attachments in email. It's a good idea to monitor the web to see what information may be being posted about you, and look at your credit report and banking information for unexpected entries or accounts. And finally, the FBI recommends you enable two-factor authentication on your email accounts whenever possible. And finally, we'll cover network-related vulnerabilities. Cisco is the manufacturer of multiple network components, such as those listed here. Multiple serious vulnerabilities have recently been announced, which could allow an attacker to access the system, conduct remote attacks, upload files, execute scripts, commit a denial of service attack, and more. Many networks out there do use Cisco products, so as always, it's important that you know what's on your network and how it's configured. By just looking at this list, you might not know whether or not your network is vulnerable or not. But it probably wouldn't be too hard to find out by looking at your hardware configuration or by talking to your subject matter experts. Most of us know Blue Coat from those alerts that pop up once in a while you're at work, telling you you're not supposed to go to certain websites. But other than that, they're products used for security and network optimization. Certain firmware versions, generally those before 3.8.4, have vulnerabilities that may allow an attacker to hijack web sessions and capture administrator login information. By now, we all know what to do. You update the firmware to remediate the vulnerability. And one more. There's a Rubra ClearPass Policy Manager, which does access control on the network. Vulnerable versions before 6.5.0 may also allow an attacker to hijack web sessions and capture administrator login information, potentially leading to further exploits. That leaves the big question. What do you need to do? As security professionals, you have an important role in protecting your networks. And one of the best ways to accomplish this is by maintaining a partnership with your IT and your cybersecurity departments. You may or may not be the subject matter expert on all of the technologies that are used by your organization, but you probably have people available that are. By working closely with them, you can better respond and prevent security issues and help keep your network secure. And related to that is knowing what's on your network in the first place, both hardware and software configurations. That way you know what vulnerabilities may apply to you. One way to become aware of those vulnerabilities is through the U.S. Computer Emergency Response Team, or U.S. CERT, which is linked in the sidebar. And finally, use the CDSE resources to keep up to date on emerging vulnerabilities and cybersecurity concepts. Before we wrap up, let's take one more poll. Out of the technical vulnerabilities that we discussed today, so everything except for the hacktivists and everything except for anything non-technical, how many of you feel that any one of them can apply to your organization? Any one of them could potentially impact your organization at some point down the chain? Okay, and coming in, a significant amount are finding that at least one of them can have some sort of impact on their network, whether at home or at work or whatever else the case may be. So we can see that they're pretty common vulnerabilities. Not only do we know that, but the adversary knows that as well. Seeing as there are common vulnerabilities, you can be sure that the adversaries are looking for ways to exploit them in order to get your information. They're monitoring the same open source resources that we can all see in order to see what the current threats are, what the current trends are, and what vulnerabilities exist. By knowing what's on your network and knowing how to secure it, you can help make yourself that harder target. Looks like we have time for just a few questions. So once again, not getting too far into the weeds on the technical implementation and implications of the vulnerabilities that we discussed today. So if you have any questions about this presentation or the resources available to you, please feel free to voice them now. So one question is, how often does US CERT update their vulnerability list? US CERT updates their vulnerability list every week in the form of a bulletin. They rate it in high, medium, and low so you can better see what potential impact each vulnerability might have for you and your organization. You can also subscribe to their bulletin. It'll send it right to your email box so you can see what's going on in that week. Of course, we'll also be discussing them on a monthly and a quarterly basis in the same format. Are any of these serious enough to put my ATO at risk? That's really the million-dollar question because, of course, we're all interested in maintaining our ATO, our accreditation standing. That's ultimately up to the authorizing official who's going to determine the acceptable risk. If they can't be remediated, discussing it with the AO so they can make a determination and let you know what you need to do in the interim. And finally, what is OPM doing to mitigate future breaches? Are there any outside agencies other than IG assisting OPM and other federal agencies that have audits indicating badly needed upgrades to network infrastructure and protect information? That is a really good question. That question is a little outside of the scope of this webinar. However, I do know that more information is coming via the usual notification channels about the breaches, what changes might be happening, and of course information for those that might be impacted as well. So keep an eye out for that. We can't expect more news coming out in the near future regarding that. I do see that some have had members that received the email from OPM for the most recent breach. Yes, there was information that was put out, that's true, although I do understand that's been halted as a more secure way of putting out that information is being sought. So of course keep your eye out for more information on that because it is going to be have widespread effects. Okay, great questions. Thank you very much. So moving on, I do want to thank each of you for joining us on this webinar, and I hope that you found the information that we discussed today to be helpful. Please check out the Privileged User webinar coming up on July 9th, and keep an eye out for 6 new Risk Management Framework courses coming up next month. Also, we've recently updated our virtual environments, including breaking out 3 unique implementations, updating the student workbooks, and upgrading the Linux environment. And remember that we'll be releasing a pre-recorded webinar like this on this topic every month, including a live session like this once a quarter. I highly recommend you take advantage of those opportunities to learn more about the issues and concerns that may come up. Until then, on behalf of the CDSE, this is Chris Cox saying thanks for viewing.